Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great.
We are recording and we can hear you. And can you hear us?
Yes.
All right. Take it away. You've got a solid hour, and can we interrupt you for questions?
Yes, of course, anytime.
All right. It is all yours.
Okay, hello everybody. Sorry that I could not be there, but I hope it will still work out well. So I will cover two topics today. One is the distortion match anatomy, which was already mentioned in the program. And the second topic, I will sort of summarize our current efforts to remove spatial bias in the gradient echo bold signal. So let's start with the first topic, distortion match anatomy. So here on the left, let's see whether I can make my pointer visible. Can you see my pointer?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So on the left, you see the mean pre-EPI, and this is a coronal slice from the back part of the brain. And here in some parts, you can actually see gray matter, white matter contrast, but in other parts not. So ideally, we would like to make segmentation of the gray matter directly on the functional images, but at this moment, we are not there yet. So the success of laminar fMRI depends on how well we can segment the gray matter. Otherwise, we don't know where the layers are, and any further analysis will be flawed. So the standard way of doing this is let's get the anatomy images. This is on the right, you see quarter from MP2 and in the quantitative T1, the white matter is dark in contrast to T1-weighted, but you see very nicely the gray and white matter contrast. So we can do very nice segmentation on this image. And the idea is, as in standard resolution MRI, to do segmentation on the anatomy, do registration to the functional, and then get the gray matter information from the functional data. So this is 0.7 millimeter isotropic. Now, if we examine more closely the correspondence, spatial correspondence between these two images, let's look just here. Here you see sort of the sulcus, the CSF like oblique, where here you see it straight. So even though at first glance it looked like the registration between these two images was good, the gray matter, when we would get the gray matter information from here, where the gray matter is, would overlay on this one, we would be not segmenting the functional images well. And which then means all the laminar fMRI analysis based on these images would be wrong. So we would get, say, superficial changes, even though in reality it might be deep layers might have changed. So obviously we can make it better with using these images with distortion correction and partial volume registration, which anyway I recommend that if you do registration, do not do registration of the entire image, but only the parts where you are interested in doing laminar fMRI analysis later on. The other way to go is actually to distort the anatomy, because if we are not doing things like clinical work on deep brain stimulation, we don't actually care much about spatial accuracy. What we care about is where are the lamina, which means if we distort the anatomy, we get this information. So how do we do this? This idea is actually quite old, but it was revived by the Polymenic group 2016. And the basic idea is to get T1 weighting in the functional images. So the way it works is we do inversion pulse, and then we do a series of pulses, and we acquire different slices. Next time when we do this, we shuffle the order of slices, and so on. What happens then now is we get from each voxel, here are 3 voxels outlined, a certain signal behavior. Let's say after the first acquisition, we had a signal like this, second acquisition like this. If we now order these data according how much after the inversion the signal was acquired, what you see is actually quite nice curves. And these curves are actually just inversion recovery, because we had done here an inversion pulse and we weight a certain amount, which means we have just an inversion recovery experiment. And inversion recovery is governed by T1, which means what we have here is a T1 recovery curve. And by fitting Bloch equation to these curves, we get T1 for each voxel, which is sort of outlined here. This is the data, and this is the model fit. And so, which means with this approach, we get T1 for each voxel, but because the acquisition themselves were EPI, it has the same distortion as the functional data. In short, in summary, with this trick, we have a T1-weighted anatomy, which is distorted the same way as the functional data. We took this idea, and this idea was in this paper. They explored sort of free surfer pipelines, and they explored whole brain segmentation and so on. We took this idea and looked at how it plays out for laminar fMRI. Sorry, this is still from this same paper. You see here the segmentation by the multi-inversion EPI versus T1 MPRAGE with multi-echo, but the multi-echo is not relevant. So you see, you can do nice segmentation of both type of images, and you see there, for example, here in the front, they are not the same, have not the same distortions. What they nicely showed is this now T1 and how many T1 values are occurring. So there are 3 peaks. One peak is white matter, one peak is mid-gray matter, one peak is pile surface. And you see, if you have in red the MPRAGE, you have a certain distribution, and you have in the multi-inversion EPI a different distribution. And for white matter and mid-gray matter, the distributions are looking very similar. However, the big differences are at the pile, which means the biggest errors probably, if you take this data as guidance, if you use standard T1 weighted, are close to the pile surface. So where the biggest error in segmentation and later on registration will occur. So if you then visually inspect the registration segmentation quality, pay attention mostly to the pile vessels if this data is sort of reliable. Okay, so we took this idea and we did the same thing. We did 30 inversion times, and we acquired different slices, and we shuffled the slice order. We did with MATLAB T1 fitting, and then we get the T1 weighted EPI. And then you see a nice gray white matter contrast. Now, if we take the same approach as I have shown you, now this time on the right, you see not the MP2 range, but the quantitative T1 from inversion recovery. And if you look at the same structure here, this oblique, it's the same in both images. So at first glance, this seems to have worked. Now, we cannot always trust our visual inspection because we have only limited capacity to observe the images. So we need a better way of evaluating how well actually the registration and segmentation has worked. And there we run into a difficulty because we don't have any gold standard. We don't know, it means we can do perhaps some realistic phantoms and do these things, but phantoms might not be generalizable to the human brain. So it's very difficult to actually evaluate whether this has worked or not, even though the arguments and the visual inspection speak for it. So what we did is we said, let's project the mask, the gray matter mask from MP2 range and from the distortion match anatomy back on the mean EPI. So this is the mean EPI image. In green is the gray matter mask, which is identical from the MP2 range and the inversion recovery EPI. So these are the common voxels which both approaches say is gray matter. In red, you see the voxels which are from the MP2 range only labeled as gray matter. And in blue, you see the voxels which are labeled as gray matter from inversion recovery. So there are some non-overlapping voxels and there's a large amount of overlapping voxels. So if you then look here, for example, you see some parts which are gray matter in the inversion recovery, some parts here which are gray matter from the MP2 range. So the basic idea was, okay, if we now look at these voxels, let's look at the intensity of these voxels in the EPI, because perhaps we get some hints whether this one is better representation of the gray matter or this one is better representation of gray matter together with the green voxels. I've talked continuously. If you have any questions, please interrupt me and raise your hand, and then I can slow down.
Maybe I have a question. You said that this is, you do this because you don't have a ground truth. But now we still don't really know which ones to trust. Or would you say that the T1 EPI is then the ground truth? So
this is in the next slide where we will evaluate, even though we don't have ground truth, we can sort of collect evidence for or against an argument. So this is sort of perhaps a general scientific principle. If you don't know the ground truth, how do you actually decide which one is the right way? The right way is collect plausibility and evidence. And this is what we did in the next slide. This is shown here. So this is for a certain ROI here. What you see is the number of voxels, probability density. This is the mean EPI signal for all voxels from the MP2 range, which was then with distortion correction. In orange, all voxels, and in red, the non-overlapping voxels, which were sort of the voxels which were just from MP2 range, labeled as gray matter. The same for inversion recovery. Purple is the histogram for all voxels, and blue for the voxels which are just for inversion recovery to be gray matter. Now you see a certain EPI signal value, and then you see that the non-overlapping voxels, the mean value is shifted to the left. Now, what does shifted to the left mean? For that, we have to understand what determines the mean EPI signal intensity. There are many factors, but simplistically, veins and CSF, they have low signal intensity in EPI. So if you go back, here, for example, CSF is dark, veins are dark, and so on. So left is sort of veins and CSF, and right would be white matter, which means the remaining voxels here are biased towards pyosurface and veins. Whereas if you look at inversion recovery, we also see a shift, but the shift is much less compared to the MP2 range. So based on this data, which would mean even though we cannot promise that every voxels which were labeled as gray matter inversion recovery is correctly labeled as gray matter, on average, it seems to do a better job compared to the MP2 range. We go to a different ROI and we make the same observation. So, which means even though we don't have a gold standard, this data indicates that the gray matter segmentation based on the inversion recovery is more faithful to the true gray matter using the inversion recovery compared to the MP2 range. Is this argument plausible to you? Or anybody has a counter argument or question?
Okay. I guess just one quick question. Can you just, those are just, the MP2 range is distortion corrected to the EPI.
Yeah, so we do inversion distortion correction. So usually we would do distortion correction on the EPI and then register to the MP2 range. But in order to evaluate the registration accuracy, for this one we applied the the inverted operator on the MP2 range, so to distort the MP2 range into the EPI space. So to have the gray matter mask from the MP2 range in the EPI space, and the same, the inversion recovery is already in the EPI space.
I guess it worth it also to actually present the non-matching voxels on the image and see that they overlap with veins in this case. You can.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit implicitly, it's here. These are the non-overlapping voxels from MP2H.
Right.
And you see, it means a lot of these are at the border to sort of CSF and so on. Here, for example, CSF. Here is CSF. So it means, as I said, it's very difficult, and visually, I would be sort of, you can go through all voxels, all slices, and so on, get some indication, but I would not trust my visual inspection, to be honest. It's good to look, especially if you have an ROI where you have the function activation, to evaluate carefully, also with visual inspection, but for an entire sort of slab or an entire image to do with visual inspection can be misleading, so therefore I would be very carefully. But if you look at these images, here you have some white matter voxels, sort of, but most of them are in CSF, which then sort of shows, sort of confirms this behavior. But I would be really careful with visual inspection. So I would not claim this is a proof, but I would say this is, it makes a consistent story, because the EPI is the same, has inversion cover EPI has the same distortions, that the accuracy of the registration should be better than applying some processes which might not be optimal and apply some smoothing might actually result in error. So it makes sense, but of course this is not a proof. I would not claim this is a proof, but this is, I would say it's consistent with all the arguments we have why distortion matched EPI should be more faithful in gray matter segmentation. Okay. So next slide. So this is now just registration, but let's look at what comes out when we do the functional MRI analysis. This is shown here, and this is from the paper from Kashyap et al. I will not go too much into explaining what we did there, but this is now based on the MP2H, which we call the conventional workflow, and this is with the distortion matched anatomy. This is from the same data. What you see now is, let's just look at one condition, flicker. In red, you have gray matter voxels, which are most closest to the surface. In blue, most close to white matter. You see the well-known signal increase towards the surface. However, if you compare the with inversion recovery versus the flicker, versus the MP2H, what you see is the dynamic range is much larger for the inversion recovery workflow than for the conventional workflow. And the way I interpret it is, if we have registration errors and the mislabeling of the layers, means essentially this corresponds to a smoothing operator, because let's say we have layer 2 in reality, but due to segmentation and registration error, it was assigned on average to layer 2, but sometimes to layer 3, and sometimes layer 1, which is a smoothing operation, which then means we are averaging the surrounding layers, which then means the difference between layers are reduced. So the dynamic range is larger for the inversion recovery workflow. Makes sense from the argument that registration and segmentation was more accurate using this method. Now, we have also evaluated how big are these differences between these two approaches, and we evaluated depending on the ROI size, because obviously if you have a small ROI, then you might get certain differences. If you have a large ROI, you might get other differences between these two workflows. What you see here is, just look at the orange line. This is now the difference between these two workflows, and in the x-axis, number of voxels. Left means small ROI and right means large ROI. What you see is, the larger the ROI, the smaller the differences. Or in other words, the bigger the ROI, the less is it relevant and which workflow you are using. And the reason is, as you have seen, even with MP2H, when we do distortion correction, if I go back to this one, the number of voxels which are non-overlapping is small compared to the overlapping voxels with the inversion recovery, which means if you take an ROI like here, then if the ROI is small, then the arrows might be big. But if you take a large ROI, the arrows are becoming smaller and smaller because majority of the voxels are correctly labeled. Second, even inversion recovery EPI is not perfect because these are the inversion recovery EPI is acquired in a different run. And if the subject has moved, the distortions are slightly different, which means also here you have some mistakes, which then means the larger the ROI, the smaller the difference between the workflows. Or in other words, if you do an experiment and you analyze a large ROI, you still should be careful and you still should be examine the registration and segmentation very carefully and manually correct if necessary. However, the arrows are smaller compared to if you have a small ROI. There you have to really make sure that everything works perfectly because just number of voxels you are using is small and every arrow has a big impact. Okay, so I go now to the third study, which has been done using inversion recovery EPI. This is from Wietske van der Zwaag from Amsterdam, and she used a nice trick because the problem with the approach what we were using a lot of inversion times, and also Renval, Polymene, they were using a lot of inversion times. A lot of inversion times means long scanning duration. And so what they did is actually they did a 180-degree pulse and they just did 2 EPI readouts. And the interesting idea is this is sort of analogous to the MP2-range approach, which means if you have a lookup table with T1 values how the inversion recovery should be, then you can actually, by just having 2 points in the inversion recovery curve, you can actually determine T1 values, which obviously accelerates the acquisition enormously, and you can get much better or much faster distortion match anatomy than with having the brute force many inversion recovery times approach. So this is an example. This would be an EPI from the first inversion time, EPI from the second inversion times. Then you can calculate T1-weighted and T1 map. And they compared the this T1-weighted and T1 map with the MP2-range, which has obviously, for example, you see a very nice gray and white matter contrast here, for example, and then you see also nice T1 contrast in the, this T1 to 3D EPI. However, it looks a little bit noisier. Again, they also use the histogram method and look at T1 values. In red, you see the new approach. In blue, you see the MP2 range for gray and white matter. This gray matter is white matter. And you see they overlap. The center of them are quite overlapping. However, this one has a broader distribution, which means it's noisier. But on average means the gray matter segmentation is actually quite similar between these two approaches. So this is now illustrated here in MP2 range. You see here segmentation. Segmentation looks very nice because you have a nice gray and white matter contrast. The same segmentations overlap on the mean EPI, and here you see some errors. For example, if you see here this part, this is gray matter, but the MP2 range said it's CSF. Whereas if you go to the inversion recovery, the inversion recovery, the new approach, T1, 2, 3, the EPI, you see actually it would label this as gray matter. So again, this approach shows that it is more faithful to the gray matter segmentation relative to the mean EPI. However, as you also see, it's noisier. Now, they also evaluated the effect of the alignment, missegmentation, misregistration of the MP2 range on the fMRI data. Here you see the layering, coronal slice, the different layers. And what this graph is not very easy to see, but this is left is white matter, right is CSF. This is the average T value of the bold signal activation. In solid line, you see the new approach. You see from white matter to CSF, the signal is increasing. So this is what we are observing. And if you take MP2 range, it's also increasing, but is increasing lower, which actually is confirming the same finding as we have here. MP2 range has a lower dynamic range than the inversion recovery workflow, which is sort of the same finding as in this paper. MP2 range, the slope of the increase towards CSF is lower than if you use the distortion match anatomy because of inherent smoothing operation in the MP2 range approach. So it makes sense. To summarize this part, for laminar fMRI, in particular for small ROI sizes, distortion match anatomy preserves spatial information more than standard T1 approaches. However, even for distortion match anatomy, I recommend to be careful. As I said, usually distortion match anatomy is acquired in a, not usually, it's always acquired in a different run, which means if the subject has moved between the runs, and we know that experimental sessions can be like 2 hours, then the distortions will be slightly different. And if these distortions, which are slightly different, are in the ROI of interest, you can also get errors in the inversion recovery EPI compared to the mean EPI of that run. So even then, you should be careful and visually inspect how good the registration and so on has been. So in second recommendation, I would always do partial volume registration. So if you register the entire brain or slab, what essentially you're doing is the cost function for registration optimize for the entire slab or brain. However, if you do laminar fMRI, you are usually interested in a small patch of cortex, which means you're optimizing registration in parts of the brain which you are not further analyzing. And there's no reason for doing this because it might then do some misregistration, the ROI of interest. So what I would do is either there are different approaches with different software, but emphasize around the region of interest that the registration should be optimized around that part so that the cost functions are minimized in that part. If there's mass registration somewhere else, you essentially do not care because you want to have the registration in the region of interest. You have to obviously select a little bit the larger patch of cortex because you have to have some spatial information. So not just select the region of interest, but a larger patch. But it should still be partial volume registration. And we, in our experience, if we had, for example, 2 different ROIs, if you registered the entire slab or one ROI, the other ROI was not optimal. So even with distortion match anatomy, you should be careful and examine the results. And consistently with Renval and Witzke van der Zwaag and also the study of Kashyap, there is spatial smoothing involved in the T1 acquisition with standard T1 acquisition as reference. The reason is, one is the misregistration, and the second is the distortion correction is a smoothing operator by itself, which means if you do distortion correction of the function and then register to anatomy, this also is a smoothing operation. I would recommend to leave the functional space as intact as possible. It means apply inverse distortion correction on the anatomy to get into the functional space. Okay, this was my first part. And before I move to the second part, any questions to the distortion match anatomy? Yes?
So looking at this slide, you know, when I first saw it, I didn't know what you mean by partial volume registration. I thought that this is something that I missed about a way to register voxels that show partial volume. So it's a small suggestion just to use the term small volume registration. Or, you know, otherwise it can be confused with partial voluming.
Okay, I can do that. Yeah, that's no problem. Any other comments or questions?
Renzo here. Maybe you can comment on the challenges or the practicability of using the T1-weighted EPI for like automatic segmentation. Right? From the images you showed, the EPI never really looks as visually appealing like the so-called like anatomical MP2 range. It might be like just more thermal noise or ghosting or something like it's CPI, right? So it's not as beautiful. How hard is it to push this through pipelines as you would like for anatomical MP2 ranges?
Yeah, it depends on the exact parameters. For example, in the Renval, it was actually quite straightforward. There was not much needed because the spatial resolution was also lower because they did whole brain acquisition. The more you push the spatial resolution, the lower is the SNR, which means the approaches of Witzke van der Zwaag and our approach suffers them from SNR issues, which means if you just acquire longer, because these are, you can acquire these images, just repeat the same and then do averaging, you get better. In our experience, it was, we sort of did not necessarily use the FreeSurf automatic pipeline because of all the small volume problems with the FreeSurfer. So we used our own pipelines. There it worked out quite well. But that's your comment is certainly very valid because there's something, if you have some automatic pipelines, there's something to be concerned about, whether the SNR is good enough. But in our experience, it was working out quite well for the pipelines we were using.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, I move then to the second part. It's the laminar bolt signal model. This is sort of based on a paper we just published. It's in press now, 1 month, so in end of September. Let's look first at analysis strategy. So usually the fMRI signal can be formalized in a way that there is a scaling constant, which depends on blood volume, oxygen extraction fraction, T2 star, echo time, and other parameters. So this is sort of a constant for each voxel. You have then a second function, which is dependent on blood volume changes and on the oxygen globin changes. So for example, Davis model or the Buxton model, they can be formalized in that way. So this is our starting point for standard resolution fMRI. Now imagine you have two conditions. Usually when we do a general linear model, what we do is difference between these two conditions. When we do these two different conditions, let's call one condition flicker, the other condition static, the difference. If you substitute this function, call it L, you have then flicker minus static of the activation, but you have an L, you have scaling factor, which means in principle, if you think about it, GLM is then spatially biased to voxels with higher sensitivity, which means to, for example, to big veins and so on. So what people, therefore, some people who want to remove this bias in standard resolution fMRI, they remove the most strong activate voxels. For example, people who do tonotopy, they actually mask the highest voxels because these are the least specific voxels. And so in order to do tonotopy more clean, they mask the highest activation voxels, which sort of takes into account that they are, the voxels have different sensitivity, L. So even in standard resolution, we have a problem with the difference method that is biased towards voxels with high sensitivity. The other method is division. If we divide the flicker versus static, then we get actually a nice relationship. These scaling factor scales out because it's the same voxels. And we have just a sensitivity based on the physiological changes. So this approach is actually better than the difference method, but it has the weakness that voxels which are not active, for example in static, they have a low signal, which means this ratio is big. So which means it's visually and statistically very difficult to evaluate this method, even though this method might be better. So usually what people have done in standard resolution fMRI, they have done, say, calibrate bold or breath holding to get sort of normalization factor L, and then normalize the signals and then do the difference method afterwards. Now, for standard resolution fMRI, these are sort of the two most popular methods how to do it. Obviously, the first method is even more popular than the second method. Second method is not used much anymore. However, these two methods assumes that this function G is determined by local changes, which means that they are spatially independent signals. And in laminar imaging, we have a problem that this is actually not true because neighboring voxels are depending on each other. This is also true in low resolution fMRI, but in low resolution fMRI, because we do spatial smoothing, we do ROIs, this problem is not as prominent as in laminar imaging, where we have to take care of spatial biases. So let's examine first the standard fMRI signal from gradient echo API. This is a bold signal, white matter from CSF. Typically what you see is the signal increase from white matter to CSF. So this is a common observation. Sometimes you have some bumps here and some inhomogeneities, but it's a common observation that the signal increases towards the surface. However, if you go to electrophysiology, you see a very inhomogeneous. This is now CSF would be here and white matter would be here. This x-axis now time. What you would see is a very inhomogeneous electrophysiological profile. So this profile and this kind of profiles, they are very incongruent with each other, which means if you look at the spatial profiles of the GE gradient echo bold signal, it doesn't look like anything what we would expect from electrophysiology. So why this has happened? So this is now described in the paper from Martin Havlicek and me. It's impressed in Neuroimage. It was also posted in bioRxiv before. So this is now the vasculature. So we have cortical depth here. This is white matter. This is CSF. Blood comes here to the arteries, to the capillary bed, to the venules, and then to the ascending veins and drain to the pile veins. And in gradient echo bold, what we are measuring is essentially the deoxygenated part of the vasculature. So mainly this ascending veins and the venules. And we have deoxyhemoglobin transport upwards, which means if we have now activation in, say, in this layer, the deoxyhemoglobin is transported via this vein. Sorry, I think my pointer went away. Sorry. It goes up this vein and to the pile vessel, which means also in this layer and this layer and this layer, you will have bold signal changes. So this already explains that when we have activation in one layer, that in the bold signal we detect activation in all the layers on top of this layer. So we can now formalize this. The equations, there are many symbols, but in principle, it's quite straightforward. You have a local vasculature. We have Q is deoxyhemoglobin, V is blood volume. So in that layer, you have deoxyhemoglobin and blood volume changes. The blood is drained to the ascending vein. So you have also deoxyhemoglobin changes and blood volume changes here. And it's supplied by the same layer and it's supplied by the layer below. And then it's draining to the layer above. And so we can now write this down. So for the venules compartment, for microvasculature, we have the original balloon model, which is sort of the standard model for the fMRI signal. In the ascending vein, we just have mass balance. We just count what goes in and what goes out. So blood volume change in that layer is how much blood flow goes in, how much from the same layer, how much blood flow goes in from the layer below, and how much is outflow. So we just counted what goes in and what goes out. The same we do for deoxyhemoglobin. It looks a little bit more confusing, but it's just mass balance. Again, we just count what goes in and what goes out. And then by making some reasonable assumptions of baseline parameters, we can calculate a lot of things. But by the way, all the MATLAB code is publicly available in this repository in Zenodo. So if you want to play around with the model and go to this website and download all the MATLAB codes. Okay, now we looked into how much one layer activation propagates to the other layers. In the y-axis, you see the bolt signal. In the x-axis, you see white matter CSF on the left and CSF on the right. Let's look just at the blue curve. We have activated just layer 6. So we get bolt signal in layer 6, but this bolt signal propagates in layer 5, layer 4, layer 3, and layer 2 and 1. So we have some crosstalk to the other layers. And it's approximately, in this example, approximately 30%, which means these are wrong activations. This is a true activation. We can do the same thing for layer 5. Obviously, because the blood flows to the surface, layer 6 does not have any activation, layer 5 has activation, and layer 4, layer 3, and so on. This is similar to David Norris group. They are simulated based on realistic vasculature, and they have found similar results, which is very reassuring because it shows that with two very different approaches, our approach based on differential equations, their approach on realistic vasculature, we get very similar results. Now, we can use this information and to remove the spatial bias. And the way we do it is, let's assume this is our signal. This is from the paper of Marquardt et al. From my group. This is fMRI signal, white matter to CSF. These were just different conditions. You see, again, increase of the fMRI signal from white matter to CSF. Now what we are saying based on this simulations, layer 6 signal, the true layer 6 signal is the measured layer 6 signal, which means this signal does not change. However, the true layer 5 signal is the measured layer 5 signal minus some effect from layer 6. And this weighting factor is just this crosstalk, this value, how much the signal propagates to the upper layer. The same we do for next layer. The true layer 4 activation was the measured layer 4 activation minus some effect from layer 5, some effect from layer 6. So what we are doing is sequentially removing the effects of the lower layers towards the upper layer. Any questions to this approach? Yes?
Yeah, so it's very nice. What is unclear to me, if you go one slide back, is intuitively why, say, if I take the cyan curve that shows a large activation apparently in layer 6, how come the effect on layer 5 or the upper layer is relatively small? Why not the majority of that activation in layer 6 propagates to layer 5?
No,
and obviously I'm talking about adjacent layers, not only 6 and 5.
Yeah, the deoxyhemoglobin is transported away, which means it's transported away. If all the deoxyhemoglobin change would be transported away to layer 5, and then you would have the same blood volume change, and you would have the same signal. However, because you have a transit time, deoxyhemoglobin is transported to all layers. So they don't. Some still are in layer 6. Some are transported to layer 5. Some are transported to layer 4, and so on. So based on the transit time, you could even imagine if the transit time is very, very short, that you would not get any change, and so on. So it all depends on the physiological processes, how fast the deoxyhemoglobin is transported from one layer to the next. and how the blood pressure due to blood volume change in one layer affects the blood volume change in the other layer. So it means you cannot give a very intuitive explanation why exactly this value should come out, but it's a physiological process where deoxyhemoglobin is transported from one layer to the next, but not only to the next layer, but to all layers, including the piral vessel. Which means if you would calculate the deoxyhemoglobin change in layer 6, it's not the same as in layer 5 and layer 4 and so on. So the deoxyhemoglobin change was smaller in layer 5 than layer 4 and so on.
So in other words, this is it's a model of a transient activation. It's not steady state, right?
No, it's steady state, but in steady state, you still have, if you have a certain deoxyhemoglobin change, oxygenation change, the other layers do not have the same oxygenation, even during steady state. Okay?
There's a second question. Yeah.
So do you need to assume some kind of a delay time between the layers? And
yeah, it means it means there are many assumptions in the model of baseline physiology, which means what are the blood volumes, how does the blood volume increase from one layer to the next, what's the transit delay, and so on. So you have all these physiological parameters which are in the equation, which means here, if you in the paper you can find the normalized versions of these equations, and if you look at normalized versions, then you have baseline parameters. They are the main baseline parameters are blood volume distribution, baseline blood volume distribution over layers, and the transit times between the layers. So these are the main baseline parameters to insert. Obviously, we took inspiration from measured values, but these are they are just in the paper. We give justification for the values we have taken, but we also evaluate in the paper what happens if we change the baseline blood volume distribution. So, for example, here you see two different curves, the dotted ones and the solid ones. S is sort of describing how much the blood volume increases from the ascending vein from white matter to CSF, and these are two different slopes. So therefore, we sort of did a sensitivity analysis of the results, but because of the presentation, I didn't want to make it too complicated. I'm not going too much in the justification of the parameters, but yes, there are physiological parameters to be assumed in order to make these calculations. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so if we apply then this method of sequential subtraction, in the paper we call it deconvolution, but strictly speaking, it's not a deconvolution operator. So perhaps in the next publication, we have to rename it. But in the framework of this talk, let's continue calling it deconvolution. So if you sequentially subtract the influence of lower layers to the upper layers based on this approach, what you get is this same curve results in this. So even though we had increase from the signal from white matter to CSF, what you see after the convolution, there is a peak. And the peak is approximate in the middle layers, which actually is sort of for feed-forward stimuli, what we use in this experiment is sort of expected. So obviously this is not a proof, but because we know that this is not realistic, and from our expectation, this looks more realistic. To a first approximation, the method was sort of working. Now, we also applied it to VASO data, which was given by Renzo and his collaborators. This is the board signal. So sorry, the figures are not very nice because I just created them from MATLAB. Left is again white matter, right is CSF, board signal for different conditions. And they have measured also VASO. Now, let's just look at the orange curve. The orange curve goes up towards surface and it peaks in depth number 9, which is sort of closer to the surface. Whereas VASO increase and decrease again as a peak in layers number 6. So it's not the layer 6, but the layer on the x-axis, which was labeled 6. So we have a different localization of the peak. If we now apply our method of spatial deconvolution on the bold signal, what you see is, if you take the orange one, is actually the peak is now also in layer 6. So if you compare these two results, VASO and the deconvolved bold signal, they don't look identical. Obviously, we also don't expect that they are identical because this is still Venus weighted, and there are some discrepancies. However, if you look at the sort of the peak behavior is actually getting similar, at least more similar than the original bold signal, which means based on this, we get sort of confidence that our approach, even though it might not be perfect and solve all the problems, it's at least reducing some spatial bias. Now, if you go back to these equations, these are dynamic equations, first order differential equations with as a function of time, which means it's actually not, it cannot only apply to steady state, but it can also apply to the entire time course. And which we did here. This is now from OHPM abstract from 2019, where Martin gave a presentation at the OHPM conference. I will just summarize this. This is taken from the Emily Finn paper published 2019. Sorry, this is not 2018, this is 2019, Nature Neuroscience. They did, I will not go too much into depth of the task. Renzo can tell more about this because he is collaborator on this project. And we have extracted we created our time courses based on this. They didn't show real time courses, but we had gathered information and create our time courses and assume that the VASO is reflecting the neuronal space-temporal profiles. Here now, the y-axis is cortical depth, white matter is here, and CSF is on top. You have the stimulation period, you have 2 peaks, as in VASO, and then we have another condition at the end, which doesn't do much in this condition. However, we have this in the second one, we have again these 2 peaks during simulation, and then in the condition A, we have another peak in the bottom layers. Now we take our model and make neurovascular coupling and calculate the oxyglobin and in the venules and the ascending vein. And what we are getting is the bold signal. So the first observation is, if you look at just this part, here we have 2 peaks. The second peak is, the lower peak is almost gone, and we have only a peak in the top. And this peak is even shifted more up. Whereas, so which means if you would look at just as this data, you would never imagine that this data is created by this data. And because we have used mathematical equations, we can actually say with confidence, the cause of this profile, it was this profile. But there's no resemblance, which also comes back to my argument that the bold signal using grain echo approach does not resemble electrophysiology. And using our model, it would be weird if it would resemble electrophysiology. Now, it gets worse. If you look at this condition where we had just a peak in the bottom layer, again, this peak in the bottom layer is almost gone, and we have actually a peak in top layer. So if you look at the bold signal, you would make a difference method, coming back to the initial slides where I argue the difference method might not be very good. If you make a difference method, the difference method would say the biggest difference is in the superficial layers. However, if you look at the neural activity profile, the biggest difference was in bottom layers, which means the difference method using laminar imaging, you have to be very careful. Now, if you take then this profile and then make a cortical profile, because we want to know whether we can invert this model and get our original neural activity. So we have our bold signal profile for the 2 conditions. We add then some noise and we create some voxels based on binning. and then we create something like something what would resemble how a measurement would be done. Now, I found this very interesting when I saw this, because here you see we have a very homogeneous, or we have induced homogeneous activation in layers independent on where they are distributed. However, if you look at what would be actually measured, it looks very inhomogeneous. So for me, this is a very strange effect, because as you know, when we look at laminar bold data in the original space, in the function space, it's very difficult to see whether there's homogeneous activation in the layers. And this data suggests it will remain very difficult, because the voxel size are too big and the noise is too high. However, if we then do this, take this data, do model inversion based on our model, what you get is first, I will not go too much into depth with the time course, but data points generated are in circles, and the fitted data is the solid lines. We can actually create this the entire time course relatively well. And here you see the second peak based on this activation in the bottom layers, which however propagates to the upper layers. And if we then take this bold signal and invert, look at the neuronal part of the inversion, what you see, obviously because our voxel resolution which we simulate is not as high as the original one, because we have many more sort of distinctions. What you see is we see sort of the two peaks, so that's good. But more importantly, we recover the peak in the bottom layer, which if you look at the original data which we use for spatial deconvolution, there was only a peak in the top layer and some distribution here and some small peak here. So you get actually the peak, recover the peak in the top layer and the bottom layer. So to show the profiles, the original profile was like this in the lightly shadowed, and the recovered one is here, which actually resembles it quite well. So this was more described in the OHBM abstract, and we are sort of preparing a publication on this. So obviously this is all toy examples, but it gives us confidence that actually using this kind of model, we can recover the neural activity time courses dynamically. Or if you don't trust the dynamic part, it can be used also for steady state removal of spatial biases. Now I have one more data before ending. I think my time is also ending now. I will just do very quickly. This is an unpublished study where we do laminar fMRI using active spin labeling, where we did with 0.9 millimeter isotropic, where we did active spin labeling, and we acquired bold. In active spin labeling, you get bold and CBF at the same time. Here you see the bold activation. The biggest activation is on the surface. And in these voxels, we don't have activation in CBF, which we do not expect. Here you see the activations based on bold data. You see the zigzag based on labeling. And based on selection of CBF, you see the zigzag. However, this bold activation is quite small. So we have now did laminar imaging with blood flow and bold signal based on ASL. What you see is here the profile, white matter to CSF for two different areas, V1 and V2. White matter is on the left, CSF is on the right. You see the standard increase of the bold activation. To our surprise, the blood flow actually was larger in the bottom layers than in the surface layers. Now, the question was, is this increase towards surface consistent with the decrease of activation using blood flow? So we took this blood flow and inserted in the model, and what you get is actually, if you simulate the bold signal, you get this increase of the bold signal, which means even though the activation was also in this one using blood flow was larger in the bottom layers, it can cause a larger activation in the bold signal closer to the surface, which also means so far so good. Again, the model itself, you can download the MATLAB code here, if you want to play around with the parameters and so on. To summarize this part, in great knuckleball signal, laminar fMRI signal is ascending vein weighted, and which means we get unidirectional spatial blurring towards the surface of the cortex. Our spatial blurring is perhaps not the right word, spatial bias. The laminar bolt signal model based on mass balance principle can, in my mind, account for this effect during steady state and the transient phases. We have done plausibility tests using simulations, like the MLFIN data, but also using vaso and blood flow. And so far, the data is consistent with everything, which means so we have actually quite confidence that it improves. There might be further improvements possible, but my argument would be, because we know the gray knuckleball signal is misleading, if you take it at face value, it's better to do something than interpret directly in the original without any further processing. Difference and division methods are not correct in laminar. They're also not correct in the low resolution fMRI, but there the problems are less. So therefore, my recommendation would be remove spatial bias based on our method or based on David Norris' approach, which is similar to our method during steady state. Then you can still use division method if you have two conditions to remove for different T2 stars or blood volumes in different layers in order to remove any further spatial bias, but only as second step. First step, you have to do spatial bias removal. And with that, thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I have a question. How do you consider the vein size difference in the different layers?
Can you repeat? Can you speak a little bit up, please?
So how do you consider the difference of the vein size in the different layers?
Yeah, it means the vein size, we have this factor S, which sort of describes how the blood vessel volume increase towards the surface. And with that parameter, you can control whether you don't have any increase or a large increase towards the surface and so on. For great echo, the exact vessel diameter does not matter too much for this regime. But what's more important is the total blood volume, which is obviously related to the vessel diameter.
The size also relates to the T2 star K.
Yes, but this is determined completely by the blood volume and the oxygenation. So so therefore the T2 star, baseline T2 star is, if you have baseline blood volume and we have baseline blood oxygenation, it's already fully determined. Yes?
Yeah, then so again, I would maybe again ask about your second to your last point on the summary slide there, because it's a quite serious point, right? And like that we cannot really trust divisions of or like differences of contrast. And many layer fMRI papers in the past, or also in the special issue you edited, people try to conclude neuroscientific findings based on just differences. So would you say that those are wrong? How serious is this point?
So I'm always very careful to say something is wrong, because it always depends on a lot of things like effect size and so on. My point is more like be careful. And for me, the second point is I'm not sort of criticizing the work of others, previous work, because we are learning by doing, which means what I'm doing perhaps in 2 years will be outdated also. So therefore it would be a little bit arrogant to say everything is wrong, always looking back from the last paper. What I would say is we are getting more and more sophisticated as a field. We understand more how laminar fMRI is working. We have more contrast. We are getting more neuroscientific insights. And by learning, we should sort of improve the way we are approaching laminar fMRI, and also how we interpret results. So that's more my point than saying something is wrong, because these studies usually pave the path to making very good studies, and without examining closely the effect size and how people have done and how people have analyzed the data, I would not claim just based on the different method is wrong that their results are wrong. So I would be just saying, be careful making too strong conclusions when you know that there might be spatial bias involved. Yes?
So in your model, actually, so all the data from upper layers, kind of you have a progression of the value from the first layer, right? So what I'm saying is, if you have noisy data in your deep layer, so this noise may be amplified in your upper layers.
Yes.
Do you feel?
Yeah, it means it's obviously if you have unreliable data in the lower layers, then I would not use method because you don't want to you want to solve problems and not amplify problems. So which means if you use these methods where you say we don't know whether the lower layer signal was 1% or 5%, then I would say it's perhaps you would do more damage than reduce the spatial bias. So I would not do that. But the one thing which is so interesting is we have the issue of physiological noise, which we didn't investigate, how it sort of would affect this kind of things. So I think there are still things to further investigate than what we did. But yes, you're right. If you have unreliable data in lower layers, then you might create more problems than solve.
Makes sense. Yeah, and we have a question from Natalia, who's off camera.
Hi, Kamil. I was also quite surprised by the CBF profiles. I wonder if you have any insights on how they came about.
So actually, so it means initially it's surprising, but if you look at our 2018 paper with Ingo Marquardt, in V1 we get actually sort of two peaks in layer 6 and layer 4. And if you apply some smoothing on this profile, then you get actually this decrease from layer 6 to layer 1 of sort of blood flow, which means it would be consistent. Or in other words, neuroscientifically, we have direct projection from LGN to layer 6 and layer 4. And because the CBF has lower spatial resolution and perhaps more inherent smoothing, if it's sort of the profile might be consistent actually with what we expect.
Okay, makes sense.
All right, I think we're going to head out for a coffee break. Kamil, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody has been invited to join the same Slack team now. We'll spend the day getting good at that. But I'm going to tell people, Kamil, that if they have more questions for you, they can just post it and tag you on this channel.
I'm happy to answer more questions. And as I said, the code is available publicly. If you have questions on the code and so on, I would be happy to answer. And Cheryl, thanks for making this possible. And sorry that I could not be there.
I'm glad the technology brought you to us anyway. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.